Hello, I'm Earl Taylor, Chief Marketing Officer at the Marketing Science Institute. As many of you know, nonprofit MSI serves as the bridge between marketing theory and business practice, and our goal is to move the needle on significant marketing problems. We do this by funding research by leading academics worldwide on topics voted by our corporate sponsors and disseminating that research through members-only events in our variety of publications. I'm very pleased to welcome you to another MSI For Members by Members webinar. This is a series of webinars on the subjects related to MSI's current research priority topics. And today's webinar is the second in our Best of MSI series based on feedback we received from attendees at our events in 2016. The presentation you'll see was voted among the very highest rated of any presentations in 2016, so we're delighted to have this as a reprise. First, I'd like to point out the chat with presenter function in the left-hand corner of your screen. Please use this feature to send through any questions you have for Anindya during the presentation, and we will gather the questions and have a brief Q&A session following the presentation. Now, I'd like to introduce you to today's featured speaker. Anindya Ghose is Professor of Information Technology and Marketing and Director of the Center for Business Analytics at New York University's Stern School of Business. And the title of his talk is New Frontiers in Mobile Marketing Using Data Analytics. Anindya was named by Poets and Quants as one of the top 40 professors under 40 worldwide. He is the youngest ever recipient of the Distinguished Fellow Award from the Informs IS Society. He's a scientific advisor to companies and has consulted in various capacities with a number of companies, many of them including MSI members such as Facebook, NBC Universal, Adobe, and Microsoft. He has received 15 Best Paper Awards and nominations. He has been profiled widely in a variety of media, the BBC, Bloomberg TV, CNBC, The Economist, Financial Times, Forbes, and on and on. He is quite the authority on his subject today, and he is also author of TAP, Unlocking the Mobile Economy. So we're delighted to have Anindya today, and with that, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you all for having me here. It's a real pleasure to be able to share some of my and my colleagues' work in this space. So what I thought I'll do today is, given that we have about half an hour or so, walk you through some of the most recent projects my colleagues and I have done in the field of mobile marketing, and give you a flavor, sort of, as to what I think is on the horizon in the next few years in this space. Okay. So the first thing I'd like to do is, just give you the big picture, like what makes me super optimistic and so very bullish about the potential of the mobile economy is, if you take a look at this particular slide, where you see what we are doing here is we are looking at the division between how much time people are spending on a given media and how much advertising dollars are being pumped in that media. Okay, so the original source of this slide is from Mary Meeker's internet presentations. So what you could see here is that we have 5 main channels where consumers tend to get their information. So we've got print newspapers and magazines, we've got radio, we've got television, we've got internet, and we've got mobile. Okay. Now, as of 2015, which is the last year for which we have sort of this breakdown, what you'd see is on the green color indicates how much ad money or advertising money is being pumped in, and the blue portion of the circle will indicate how much time people are spending. Okay. So while you will see, for example, that radio and TV and sort of the internet, the desktop internet, are more or less efficient in the sense that there's a commensurate amount of ad spending with respect to time spent by consumers, you have 2 big inefficiencies between print and mobile. So in newspapers and magazines, we're only spending 4% of our time, but 16% of ad dollars are still pumped into the print magazine, newspaper channels. But if you look at mobile, we have the opposite problem, where we're spending at least 25% of our time, but only 12% of ad dollars are being spent. Okay, so that gap between time spent and ad spend is easily a $22 billion opportunity in the U.S. alone. And if you take the next 5 countries in terms of mobile ad spending, which is basically China, South Korea, Brazil, Germany, and India, that number very quickly gets into hundreds of billions of dollars. Okay. So it's been sort of that inefficiency and those gaps in monetization that have been triggering my curiosity, and so the work that I'll walk you through is essentially an attempt to see how we can address that gap and what are some of the what are the kind of techniques, what are the kind of experiments one can do to better understand consumers, and so on. Okay. So first and foremost, one thing that I'd like to start off by saying is I meet a lot of skeptics who will essentially be skeptical because they will only be looking at something like final conversions or final purchases on your smartphones and tablets. So yes, that number is about 4 to 5% of the entire e-commerce or the entire retailing economy, for example. But if we actually do something known as attribution and try to trace back, how many of these mobile exposures have in fact influenced purchases on other channels, be it desktop, or sometimes we can even trace it back to offline, that number very quickly goes from 4 to 5% to about 30 to 40%. Okay. So one of the things that I like to point out to people who are skeptical is it's important for us to use the right metrics, and it's myopic and in many ways to only look at final sales or conversions on your smartphones and tablets as the only metric. Okay. So that being said, just to give you a sort of a big picture on what I'm going to talk about. So my colleagues and I have spent a fair bit of time looking at various aspects of the mobile economy. And in most cases, given the nature of the data, it's very atomic, granular user-level data. We've been fortunate to be able to look at the same consumer's behavior over multiple time periods, over multiple touch points, and multiple devices. So some of the work that we have done includes looking at advertising or monetization capabilities through SMS text messages or on mobile video campaigns, of course on the mobile web and the mobile app. Some of you are probably aware of the campaigns that are using location-based data, but we've also worked on a wide variety of other campaigns that essentially accentuate location data with contextual data, as well as something which I personally find very fascinating, known as trajectory-based data. So in a nutshell, and I'll get into details subsequently, in a nutshell, what trajectory really means is that it's not possible and very much, in fact, happening in different parts of the world where we as in marketers or retailers or stores can track as people move around their business, or they're shopping in a shopping mall, or maybe they're in an airport, or whichever setting that you can think of. If we can actually trace back the consumer's path and see what are the kind of stores that he or she is going to and what he or she is buying, that's a lot more richer information than simply looking at the immediate location or the immediate context of the consumer. Okay. So my work spans multiple countries. We have worked obviously in the U.S., but also substantially in Asia, in China, and South Korea, in India, and different parts of Europe. Germany, for example, is a study that I'll talk about. Okay. So the techniques that we have used in our work includes a spectrum of methods and tools. Obviously, there's a lot of data here, so you need various forms of statistical modeling and econometrics. But given the nature of the questions that interest us, we've also been working extensively on designing many randomized field experiments. Some of these are quite massive, and we've also had to use machine learning techniques sometimes to be able to trace back a consumer's path or to purchase. So you'll get a flavor for these sort of tools as you go along. So our work is essentially identified that there are 9 forces that are shaping this mobile economy, and in fact this is the subject of my forthcoming book that Earl was very kind enough to mention, and I have a slide at the very end giving a little more about that. But over the last 8 or 9 years that I've been working in this space, what we have identified is that there are 9 unique forces driving this economy. This is the mobile economy today in 2017 is about 4.2% of the world's GDP, which translates into about $3.1 trillion. And it's only going to get bigger, and it's only going to increase from here onwards. So my hope and my attempt in identifying these forces is to be able to convey to marketers and to companies how to leverage not just each of these forces in isolation, but in fact, what we've often seen is you can really harness the synergies when you combine these forces with each other. Okay, and again, you will see, as I go along, you'll see some of this flavor to start with. Okay, so it's a context basically is sort of what I call the super force, but there are 8 other forces that are fairly, in fact, unique compared to the current context. So there's location, there's time, there's saliency. Saliency, for example, refers to how visible your ad or your offer is in this what I call this information overloaded economy. We are basically, we are in an attention deficit and an information overloaded economy, and so saliency matters in such an economy. One study I'll talk to you about today is work that we've done looking at how crowdedness in people's contexts influences, their propensity to respond to mobile offers. We've done some work with other forces such as weather, with omnichannel, which I call tech mix. But the crux of my presentation today is going to focus on what I refer to as trajectory-based mobile marketing. And so this is what really excites me, because I truly believe this is sort of the future frontier in this space, where we're not just looking at your immediate location or immediate context or immediate factors driving your behavior, but we're basically able to trace back, what you've been doing historically in the physical offline world. Obviously, we have been doing this in the online space for more than a decade now, but to be able to do this in the physical offline world is really exciting and has some very interesting implications for us. Okay? So for those of us who may not be fully familiar with some of the terms I'd be using, I'll give you a couple of examples. So when I, for example, use the word geofencing or geo-conquesting, what I'm really referring to here is the idea that if you look at the screen here, here's a consumer who gets a coupon based on his or her current location, and that sort of the location is essentially an artificial fence that is created by stores and retailers in the immediate proximity. These stores have the ability to change the circumference and the radius, obviously, and make it shorter or longer. But the basic idea is that depending on where you are, you'd be amenable to receive these location-based offers from stores in close proximity. Okay, so do these things work? In fact, some recent work has in fact shown that yes, a lot of these geofencing and geoconquesting offers do in fact work. So, one study looked at the effectiveness of sending food and beverage coupons using Dunkin' Donuts, and they were getting up to 3.6% redemption rates, which is basically actual conversion and actual sales. And if you compare this back to some of the traditional marketing techniques like direct mail or email, those numbers are almost twice what we've seen using email or direct mail. So there's early evidence that these techniques were beginning to work. Okay. So that brings me to my first study, which is basically a study looking at how companies, brands, again stores, various sorts of marketing companies can exploit and leverage and harness the difference in distance between a given consumer and their particular establishment. So what you see here is a study that my colleagues, co-authors Dominic Molitor, Martin Spann, Philipp Reiter, and I did in Germany. This was a pretty massive study in the following sense that we were able to work with more than 3,500 participating firms across 374 cities and towns in Germany. This obviously involved a consortium of companies, so it was non-trivial to put it all together. But once it came through, it started giving us some really interesting results. And sort of, the simplest question, the way I would phrase is that, what should be the appropriate discount given by a firm to a consumer based on his or her real-time distance? There's no reason that Starbucks should send the same discount coupon if it's got 100 customers and they're all in different distances from a given Starbucks. What they should really be doing is customizing the discount, because what generally happens is if you're further away from a store, you'd need a higher discount to incentivize you to come to the store. Whereas if you're really close enough, you probably don't need as much of a high discount, and a smaller discount can incentivize you. Okay, so it's those differences in sort of consumer psychology and consumer behavior that hadn't been, sort of really leveraged or harnessed before, and that was our goal here, is to look at, as you'll see an example, the first offer on the screen is for somebody who's about 357 meters away, whereas the fifth offer is about somebody who's 4 times the distance away, just a little more than a kilometer. And so presumably, the fifth offer coming from whichever establishment that is, that store has to give you a higher incentive. And then one way of giving you a higher incentive is basically to increase the discount that they would give you compared to the store on the top, where you're already pretty close, given that you're 300 meters away. Okay? So we found some really remarkable levels of redemptions when we leverage these distance discount trade-offs. Okay? Another project we did in the Far East, and this involves work that we did with the likes of SK Telecom, which is one of the two largest telecom providers in South Korea, and SK Planet is a subsidiary, is basically looking at how differences in people's commuting patterns can be harnessed to incentivize them to respond to mobile offers. So in this case, we work with various food and beverage brands as an example, other sorts of retailers. And what we saw is that, again, as telecom providers obviously know a lot about our commuting patterns, given that our mobile phones are constantly sort of spitting out data about locations. And so we could essentially figure out for the sample of customers that we work with, which was in several thousands, that what their average commuting pattern was and the days that they would deviate. So typically, let's say from Monday to Thursday, we might have our regular commuting from work to home and then back. And then maybe on Friday and on the weekends, we make some additional stops. Instead of going to work, we might, go on a leisure trip or a trip to a shopping mall or some other stops. And it's those differences in our commuting behavior that we found we could harness and, again, increase the level of positive responses to these offers in a non-trivial way. In fact, in some cases, those redemptions were 3 to 4 times higher than the average. Okay? Another thing that we could do is, and this is a screenshot from one of the busiest parts of Tokyo in Japan, near the Shibuya crossing, where you can imagine that at any point in time, it's a bit like Times Square in New York, where you've got thousands of people crossing that hotspot in downtown Tokyo. So we would know, for example, which are the brands that bought up billboard space in those electronic billboards. And then, obviously, if we can predict that, John Doe is going to be there in Shibuya Crossing at Friday at 2 p.m., and there's obviously some probability that you might get exposed to the billboard, then we could, again, create some sort of an omni-channel effect by sending you a mobile offer for the same brand, just as when our model predicts that you're going to be out there in the downtown part of the city. Okay, so. But the idea being that there is some probability that you will get exposed to the billboard ad, and if you could time our mobile ad or the mobile offer in a way that around the same time when you see the billboard ad, you also get the offer from us, then that's going to create some synergies. Okay, and in fact, again, those kind of omni-channel synergies between offline and online do in fact lead to substantial increase in redemptions. Another study we did looked at harnessing the differences in crowdedness, and this was interesting in a number of ways, in the following sense that you can imagine many sort of contexts where it gets really crowded, like a train station or a subway station. And so many years back, social psychologists have sort of predicted that we have these sort of negative responses to crowdedness. So sometimes it creates hostility or discomfort of some kind. And so what people need in such situations is some sort of an escape, right? And so it turns out that clearly you can imagine that your mobile device can become a great way to escape from that sort of a discomfort feeling when you're surrounded by strangers, it's crowded, whether it's when you're going to work or some other context. And given the fact that most of these public transportation systems around the world, at least in the larger cities, have varying levels of crowdedness based on different times of the day, we thought, hey, why not leverage those differences and see if we can do something about that. And so that's what we did. We designed, again, a field experiment, and this was joint work with Michelle Andrews, Xiuming Lo, where we basically send about 10,690 users these SMS-based coupons. And an example of a coupon would look something like this. So let's say a telecom provider wants to sell you a package for missed call alerts. Sometimes when you're in the subway, way down below the surface, you don't get great cell phone receptivity, whether it's 4G or LTE. And that's why sometimes you don't get to see who's calling you, and sometimes you don't even get that call. So, here's an example of a telecom provider that says, look, if you subscribe to this particular package, then you would know who's actually calling you even when you're deep inside the subway. And just for today or for this particular time period, we'll give you, a 30% discount. So instead of paying, $9, you can get $3 off and just pay $6. Okay. So the question again here was, fairly simple, and the question was, should we send you this offer when your context is more crowded or when it's less crowded, right? So like I said, in the past, the literature had shown that, people respond somewhat negatively to increasing crowdedness, especially when it comes to sort of, retail context. Okay? However, much to our sort of surprise, what we saw and what you see on the screen is, we found that there's actually a positive impact of increasing crowdedness on the actual purchase rates. And on sort of the x-axis, you will see the crowdedness increasing from about 1 person per square meter to about 5 at the end. And you basically see, a very steady increase with the level of crowdedness. And in fact, towards the end, gets pretty nonlinear. And so really what was happening here was, people said, we followed up with surveys, and these were all, various sort of field experiments. We also harnessed various natural experiments. So the results are totally causal. I'm sort of skipping the details, but I'm happy to send these papers along if anyone's interested. But more importantly, what we found out from follow-up surveys is that people said, look, when we are surrounded by all these strangers in fairly crowded contexts, our mobile device becomes our escape, and we totally immerse ourselves in these devices. And if in those 20 minutes of our commute, if you're able to send us a relevant offer, you're far more likely to see a response from us. And that's basically, what we continue to see as we tried other product categories and so on. Okay. So that brings me to my sort of the last set of studies that I want to focus on, where I'm saying, look, so far I've talked to you a little bit about leveraging location, about time and distance, about crowdedness. But now sort of the most exciting thing along the way is, and people often underestimate how quickly this is coming, but having done this now in a couple of countries, I can tell you what's really coming our way is the ability of firms and retailers and stores to be able to not just look at where we are at this point, but also trace back where else we have been in the immediate in the immediate past. Okay, so and that's what I call sort of trajectory. Okay. So here's an example. So you're in a shopping mall, and like any big shopping mall or any big department store like Macy's, you've got multiple vertical layers in terms of the number of floors. Obviously, these are also horizontally very widely spread. And so rather than saying, look, here's a John Doe who's standing in front of this jewelry store, and so maybe the jewelry store should send him a coupon, it's quite likely that he's just walking past it, or he's just taking a pause in his, while taking a stroll. So he's not standing here because he's about to enter. He's just standing there because he was taking a break from his shopping. So what would be far more useful is to see where else has John Doe been shopping today in this shopping mall. So he might have entered on the ground floor and taken the escalator down to the basement, and then come back to the 3rd floor, and then taken another elevator to the 7th floor. And if you could actually figure out, where else has he been shopping today, that would be far more, presumably at least theoretically far more useful than simply saying, okay, he's so far away, or he's 10 feet away, or he's standing in front of this store. The Apple store is right next door, so maybe that's where he's headed to. Okay. So it's that sort of, far more richer trajectory information that we want to leverage, and this led us to working with, some of the largest shopping malls. And one such example is a mall in the Far East where my co-authors Bebe Lee, Siwan Liu, and I worked in designing a massive field experiment looking at targeting people with different kinds of mobile offers based on not just the trajectory data, but also based on the other factors that I've talked about, like location or time or random offers and so on. Okay. So how do we get access to such information? So like I said, what's sort of coming our way is more and more shopping malls and department stores, offering Wi-Fi services. And what was really important for us is to be obviously, very, very transparent about how we do this. And so at the time of signing on the Wi-Fi, what we made it very clear to the consumers is the following. If you would like access to the free Wi-Fi, then that would give us access to your actual shopping patterns in the shopping mall, and we would know, for example, which are the stores you're going to. But in return for you bartering that data with us, we would be sending you highly personalized, curated offers. Okay. And, so I expected maybe 10, 15% opt-in rate, but we got 81, on an average, we got 81% opt-in rates on any given day when we carried this out over, multiple weeks. And I'm talking about, on an average, you're getting 100,000 people coming into one of these malls. Okay. So, the scale of the data and the scale of the opt-in probability is really sort of took us by surprise, and in somewhat of a pleasant way, obviously. The bigger the data, the better algorithm will work. But it also fundamentally, gave me a much more deeper insight into consumer psychology, and I'll get to this at the very end. But I firmly believe that one of the things that I've seen the last 7 to 8 years is consumers' propensity to barter their information and data in return for a relevant and personalized offer. That is changing rapidly in the sense that more and more consumers, even though, we might say we really, really care about our data privacy and all that, we are far more willing to actually share information and barter the data, but in return for a relevant offer. Okay. Now, the firms that do this well are the ones who are able to figure out what a relevant offer is for a given consumer, but some of them don't, and that's where sort of the differences are. Okay. Okay, so how do we look at the similarity between people? Sort of the core component is this requires some non-trivial machine learning algorithms, but I'll try to keep this simple and explain it in a way that's hopefully simple. And it goes the following way. So assume there are two customers, right? So John and Jane. So what I'm really looking for here is this notion that e-commerce companies like Netflix and Amazon's, or even some of the other regular media companies want to do, which is if I am on CNN.com and I'm looking at the sports page, right, and then I go to the home page and then I go back to the weather page, well, what's the fourth or the fifth or the sixth web page within my site that this person might go to? Okay, so this basically is sort of a recommender system, and e-commerce companies and sort of digital media companies have been working on this for years, right? But what we are doing and what makes this really exciting and first of its kind is that we are essentially taking that idea and translating that into the physical brick and mortar world and saying, well, if I know that you first went into the Gucci store and then to the Armani store and then to the Burberry store, well, that's telling me a lot about, like what sort of products you're looking to buy, right? So presumably high-end designer brands and so on. Okay? So it's that sort of idea where we are looking at, leveraging not just, when you enter the mall or when you exit or how fast you walk, but basically some of the core dimensions are, the semantics of your shopping pattern, which is, which stores did you visit, how much time did you spend in each of these stores, what is the sequence of the different stores that you go to, what is the spatial alignment that your trajectory would have. Some people, they will go from top to bottom in a sequential way. Some will do the other way around. They will first go right away to the topmost floor, and some others will just do it very, very randomly based on what they're looking to buy. But the fact that these people were on Wi-Fi, and one of the remarkably important thing that Wi-Fi is the Wi-Fi IP address data that you get will be able to let you know both horizontal and vertical information. Okay, which means that if I'm in the exact same spot on the 3rd floor and my friend is in the exact same spot as me but on the 7th floor, the Wi-Fi data is in fact able to tell us who's on the 7th floor and who's on the 3rd floor. Okay. So it's those advances in technology along with the machine learning techniques that involve graph-based subgraph detection and Markov chain Monte Carlo methods that let us essentially tease out the effects that we're looking to tease out. And so the experiment basically looked at, obviously we wanted multiple control groups since we wanted to evaluate how much richer is trajectory information compared to location-based marketing or random promotion marketing. And so, like I said, given the high opt-in rate, we were able to work with large groups of customers in each of the groups. So on any day, we assigned 6,000 people to each of these 4 groups. We ran this over 14 consecutive days, got close to about 84,000 unique user responses. We were able to work, again, much to our pleasant surprise, with over 252 stores in that mall. Okay, that mall has about 300 stores. So more than 80% of the stores, in fact, were, very happy to work with us on this. Okay. So what do the results show? Well, so this table hopefully is sort of illustrative of some of the key findings. And what I'd like to do is point you out to sort of the top row. The top row are the group of people who got no offers. Okay. And then the bottom row are the group of people who got the trajectory-based offers. The other 2 rows are the other mobile marketing techniques that I mentioned, location-based offers and random offers. Okay. So I would just take you to, in the interest of time, the 4th column called total money spent in the mall. Okay. So if I just take a step back, perhaps the most important thing about mobile marketing, irrespective of which technique you use, is to demonstrate that whatever sales you're getting are actually truly incremental. Okay, like sales that would not have happened if you had not sent those offers. Okay. So the 4th row, if you compare the 4th column, if you compare the first row with the last row, that's the incremental sales and spending in dollar terms that we are talking about. So people who don't get mobile offers would be spending about $85 or so, and people who did get those offers from us, that spending right away more than doubles from $85 to more than $193. Okay. And we, like I said, we had 252 different stores. So we had dozens of different product categories: apparel, cosmetics, grocery, high-end designer goods, shoes, luggage, jewelry, and so on and so forth. And obviously, there are differences among categories, but qualitatively they were all the same, right? And that was really exciting because basically what this shows is that trajectory-based advertising, when it's deployed by the stores and retailers, can lead to significantly high response rate, but also faster redemption rates. In addition, it's not just the overall mall that's benefiting. The individual stores benefit in the following way: that people are spending less time in the store, because if you're able to do a good job in finding you the relevant offer based on your previous trajectories, then what we know is, and the fact that we know what you're very likely to be interested in, it makes us send you an offer where you basically get in and get out, right? And the advantage of that is it prevents crowdedness in the stores, because when we're looking at several thousand people coming in around the same time, what we don't want is overcrowdedness in a given store. So trajectory-based marketing makes this process very efficient, but also very effective, because you're getting much higher revenues, not just for the store, but also for the mall. Okay. So a couple of things that sort of stood out for us as being really, again, very interesting and somewhat counterintuitive. Trajectory-based marketing was, in fact, the most effective in attracting the highest income group. Okay, so one of the things we have from the mall, because they use loyalty card data, is we have a lot of information about the demographics of these people. So not just their age, gender, location, but also their income levels, whatever they would have to disclose when they were signing up for the loyalty membership cards. So we found consistently that these high-income groups, in fact, had the highest redemption rate. So the reason this is good news in general is that there has been in the past some talk, all theoretical, but not demonstrated, that mobile marketing works only for sort of these stragglers and bargain hunters, the really price-sensitive, probably lower-income people that most brands don't care about. But not just in Asia, but also in Europe and now increasingly in other parts of the world, I continue to see the opposite, that mobile marketing is in fact typically the most effective with the higher income groups. Okay, and this is of course controlling for the fact that the higher income groups are more likely to have smartphones or tablets. Even controlling for all of that, we see that. So that is actually good news for brands and marketers. Okay. The one other thing that was interesting to us is there was an interesting difference between people's behavior on weekdays and weekends when it comes to trajectory-based marketing, in the following sense that even though trajectory-based marketing, mobile marketing was really super effective on weekdays, right, on weekend it was not as effective. And then we started digging deeper into this phenomenon. What we found was, look, on weekends, right, a lot of people consider a trip to a shopping mall or a department store as sort of a family trip, like a social trip or somewhat of a leisure trip, right? So they don't really care so much about effectiveness or efficiency on a weekend. They don't mind exploring. They don't mind variety seeking. They don't mind trying new stores. So on a weekend, it turns out that the non-trajectory-based offer, like some of those random ads or even the location-based ads, those actually tended to work better than the trajectory-based ad. Okay, so that was a useful insight for us to share with these stores that, when you're trying to attract people, keep in mind these differences between how consumers think on weekdays, where they care about efficiency, whereas on weekends, they probably don't care as much. The other thing that we also ended up doing in subsequent experiments was look at differences in how people behave when they are, shopping alone versus when they're shopping in groups of 2 or 3 or, with other adults. And again, there was some really remarkable, sort of differences there. We carried out separate sets of field experiments, even over a longer period this time, over 3 weeks. And we could then compare how, compare differences in shopping between those who are shopping on their own versus those who are shopping in dyads or triads or even, sort of greater numbers. So it's fairly accurate between 1, 2, 3, and 4. Beyond a group of 4, it gets less accurate. So we sort of kept it at 4. But that difference in sort of, how people shop when they're separate, single versus actually in a group or even as a couple, that was also very useful. So, one of the things we did was to essentially look at, again, how gender differences matter or how income differences matter. What we saw was the larger groups, groups of 3, are actually more responsive to mobile offers. And, clearly there's a couple of different reasons going on, more sort of possibility of peer influence there. For example, any one of them who gets an offer, even though he or she might not be the one to act upon it right away, the other folks in the group might be able to influence them to act upon it. We found that couples were actually less responsive, but even within them, older couples, again, age was a surprising insight. Older couples were actually more responsive than younger couples. I've talked about higher income consumers being more responsive. We found that men were more likely to shop alone than women, and we also found that higher income folks were unlikely to shop in those larger groups of triads or quads. Okay, and again, this is not an exhaustive list of insights. We have a lot more in the paper, but just to give you a flavor that this gives us some interesting demographic differences in how people behave, and so again, we can build on some of that. So again, just to sort of, start getting into concluding this talk, clearly, the future of mobile is super bright. I am obviously very optimistic about this because, data speaks for itself. It obviously is interesting also for, marketing scientists and brand managers and product managers and even senior marketing managers. I've often talked about these things with folks at the C-suite level. And the reason is because, as new methods and techniques are being developed by data scientists, we, in sort of the marketing world, now have an opportunity to leverage and harness those new techniques. And we can really start establishing a link now between our offline behavior and movements and our sort of preferences. And so this mobile phone becomes like a glue between the offline world and the online world. Okay? So the last thing I want to talk about is, and this is sort of 10 years of work that has now convinced me more than ever that more and more consumers increasingly see this value or this convenience trumping their any sort of data privacy concern, right? So like when I first started working in the mobile economy in 2008, this would be the other way around. But now increasingly, and clearly there are demographic differences. Millennials and Gen Zs are far, far more likely than, let's say, baby boomers. But I do see that pendulum swinging the other way now. Okay? And these sort of consumer insights led me to investigate further. And when we started looking at that, people are saying, look, we consumers, we expect brands and retailers to know a lot about us and make our lives, better or convenient or richer. And not just who am I, where I am, but I want you to know where I'm going, where I've been, what's nearby, what's going on. And so each of these are like 10, and there's actually more, but each of these 10 sort of examples are real consumers, demonstrating and telling us that this is what we want brands and retailers and companies to know about us and make our lives better. Okay. So that and everything else is, sort of the topic of my forthcoming book, which I'm very excited to just very quickly plug in. It's going to be released on April 25th. It's published by MIT Press, and I've tried to write it in a way where it has something useful for both consumers and companies. Okay, so I will stop here. It's 12:45, and happy to take any questions.
That's great, Anindya. Thanks so much. Excellent presentation. A lot of material there, and we've had a number of good questions come in. I want to remind the audience that you can send questions directly through the Chat with Presenter function in the left-hand corner of your screen. Let's pick up on that point that you made just now, that there seems to be changing, as you pointed out, that consumers appear increasingly willing to barter, as you use the term, their personal information, location, other things that you were describing, in exchange for the personalized service, the curated offers that you described. One question first, you yourself were surprised by the high opt-in rate that happened in that field experiment. As I understand that was in Asia. Do you see cultural or other types of differences in terms of the opt-in? I can imagine that once someone opts in, they are agreeing to that sort of barter arrangement you described, but the rates of opting in themselves might vary. What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, so that is something that also obviously I was curious about, and having had the good fortune of working across these 5-6 countries, one thing that I find consistent is if I take, for example, millennials and Gen Zs, there's actually no tangible or no real difference in consumers' propensity to barter data between, let's say, U.S., China, South Korea, Germany, or India. I just see no differences at all. When it comes to maybe, let's say Gen X or baby boomers, sure. I mean, there's some countries where people are a little more willing than the others, but at least in some of those age groups between, let's say, 18 to maybe the late 30s or early 40s, I just don't see any more differences. When we first started in 2008, sure, we've had big differences, but those are now very rapidly closing in.
That's interesting. So it suggests that it's more of a generational thing than it is cultural at this point.
Yeah. I would say everything that I've seen suggests to me that's pretty much strongly what it is.
I want to back up to an earlier point in your presentation. Lawrence had a question when you were talking about the geofencing, geoconquesting, sending coupons or offers based on location, proximity to a Starbucks or whatever. And the question was, to what extent does that sort of create trade down, or another term might be free ridership? In other words, I was already headed into Starbucks, I happen to receive a coupon, and so in effect, Starbucks lost money on that sale of where I would have bought at the full price anyway.
Absolutely, that's a great question, right? So this goes to the heart of what I mentioned just a few minutes back, that anything that we can claim about the effectiveness of mobile marketing has to be demonstrated as incremental, right? So in the interest of time, I skipped the details, but those field experiments that we had designed in Germany, they were meant to tease out those incremental effects, meaning that whatever redemptions that I'm getting from my customers at Starbucks, those are sales that are unlikely or would not have happened in the absence of those coupons. Okay, and the way we tease this out is by designing these test control groups with no systematic differences between them and so on. Okay, so that's one thing. The second thing that's important here is I think, and sometimes I get this question about, is it possible that consumers will start sort of gaming, in lack of a better word, gaming the system, that, oh, you know what, I normally, every morning I go to Starbucks at 8:55 before I join work. Now, as I start getting these coupons, and I know that Starbucks is customizing the coupon on a given day based on distance, I will sort of strategically stop, like, instead of 50 meters away, I'll sort of kind of stop like 100 meters away, expecting the higher discount. So it's a possibility. I haven't seen that yet, really being put into play. But obviously, that's where machine learning is important. So, when we see this sort of strategic behavior, it's not that difficult to start flagging it, and our algorithms will actually be able to catch this, right? And when we see that sort of, very conscious, deliberate attempt to mislead or game the system, then the consumer is going to be penalized. He or she is not going to get a coupon at all. Okay.
That's interesting. Well, when we have the autonomous self-driving vehicles, you can just program in that stop, to get that coupon downloaded to your device.
Exactly. Yeah.
So there's a question of clarification. I want to talk more in a moment. Some questions came up around the trajectory study that you concluded with.
Sure.
A lot of interest in that. But there was a point of clarification by Mary to saying, what is the difference between trajectory and predictive as you're using those terms?
Sure. Okay. So trajectory refers to this notion that we are tracing the consumer's shopping trajectory in a context. So, for example, I'm looking at which floor in the mall is going to, or which of the individual stores in a given floor is going to, and also obviously what he or she is buying. So that's trajectory. Now, based on that trajectory data, I am then predicting what is the next store that he or she is likely to go to, and then send a coupon or an ad based on that information. So trajectory comes first, and using that trajectory, we then use predictive modeling techniques to predict where he or she might go and then send an offer.
Great. I think that relates to another question that comes up, and that is you mentioned about identifying the real-time social groups, and that the uptake on a given offer might be greater for a group, at least up to a certain level, 3 or 4 people, because one of the group might actually be responsive where the person receiving it might not have been. But
right.
So that might also be that a trajectory of a group or even an individual could be quite different. If I'm shopping for a gift for a significant other, I may go to a certain type of store that doesn't necessarily reflect my own personal shopping preferences or habitual behavior. So, it's a problem with direct marketing and targeting and the recommendations that Amazon and other online providers have. How do you know when that is truly reflective of the individual or the group's preferences, and when you're sort of getting noise in the data, so to speak?
Sure. So that's, again, where, the cell phone is remarkably useful, right? So, typically a cell phone is not shared with people, so it is your phone. And, as we have more information about you, so let's say today, I observe you coming to the mall and I see you walking into a few set of stores. That's giving me some information about your preferences. Then in a week from now, again, you come back. That gives me a little more. So as I start to put this data trail together about you, right, I get to know more and more about your average preferences. And then when I see deviations, that's an interesting flag for me to pause and examine why the deviation happened. Okay? So it's those deviations and those comparisons with the average trajectories that are very useful for us. And given the fact that you're signing onto the Wi-Fi, we get access to both. And we are then able to leverage those differences between your regular shopping patterns and your deviations, and then send you offers in accordingly.
I think that may actually be an answer to another question that came up in conjunction with your research on trajectories. And Nuno wrote and said, at least the example you were giving at the moment seemed to be about an individual shopping trip to a mall, one day in time, a snapshot. And in fact, the most valuable information might be that individual's behavior over time, the more habitual shopping patterns. But so you're saying that you can track that as well, multiple visits across time, and have a richer profile on that individual.
That's correct, because based on the cell phone, when you sign on the Wi-Fi, for example, right, we get access to the unique hardware address number, like the MAC address of your cell phone and some of the other identifiers. So there's various sort of fingerprinting techniques that can be done much more accurately on smartphones than let's say desktops. And so it's based on those multiple identifiers we are able to retrieve and say, John Doe came 2 weeks back, then he came the week before, and now he's back here again. And clearly for some consumers we'll have more information and for some we'll have less. But that's also where our recommender system based on similarity indices are useful, right? So it's basically, put it simply, it's like on Amazon, people who bought this also bought that, right?
Right.
So we leverage those collaborative and content filtering techniques in this shopping mall context.
That's interesting. I just want to come back to a point you made at the beginning and with several examples, and that is by running the true field experiments with control groups, you're actually able to determine causality, which is the holy grail of marketing research and marketing science, obviously. I just want to mention for those of you NSI members who are in the audience today, we will be having some kind of an event, probably a workshop or perhaps a conference on designing field experiments, and look for announcements about that. That'll be an event coming up later this year, something we know is of great interest to our members. Another question had come up when you were giving the example of the crowdedness and the impact that had on response rates. The example you gave was the use of SMS text messages, and Carmen wanted to know if there's a difference between the impact of those types of messages versus more visual displays. So have you been able to test like image-based messages and response rates, or was that strictly text message?
Right, great question. So in that study, we focus only on text-based coupons, but in some non-academic consulting work that I've done with other telecom providers, we in fact have sort of changed and leveraged those differences in visuals, visual display coupons versus just pure text-based messages, or even a small audio jingle, like the coupon or the ad is in the form of an audio jingle. And yes, in fact, they do make a difference, and and not that surprisingly, like visuals do help a lot, all else equal compared to pure text. Audio jingle is somewhere in the middle. So it's sort of similar, it's consistent with what we see sort of with engagement studies on social media, where clearly like video is 5 times more, leads to 5 times more engagement than just pure text or even with the pure static display. And so similar differences and responses also accrue in this mobile marketing world.
I have a more general question, and that is about kind of, you alluded to the adoption rates and the opt-in rates and so forth, but I just saw a reference to a study earlier today that says a month after people have downloaded a mobile app, only about 5% are actually still being used, and I've seen similar studies elsewhere. And I'm wondering, is that just because we're at a very early stage of the adoption cycle and a lot of these are kind of one use and not particularly relevant once they've downloaded? I'm just wondering because, a lot of the data you're relying on, Loyalty Club and things like that, would imply that they're going to keep using that app and providing that data so the provider can customize the offer. But in fact, there seems to be a lot of abandonment of those devices or apps at this point. So what are your thoughts about that?
Sure. Yeah, great question again. So 2 things. First of all, some of the studies I mentioned in the shopping malls or in the airports, all we need is Wi-Fi, and consumers actually don't need to download an app, right? The way the Wi-Fi actually triggers an ad or a coupon is very similar to what happens in, when you sign into a free Wi-Fi in an airport, your browser basically opens up a pop-up screen and says, okay, here's, whatever the login ID or the password that the store is giving you, and you sign in, right? So it's the same technology that we've also used in our shopping mall studies and some of the other studies I mentioned that basically does not require a consumer to have downloaded the app before. And it's precisely because we know that making a consumer use the app consistently over time is non-trivial. Okay. Now, the second thing that was also very interesting was that many malls are essentially sending you, or many establishments are sending offers through beacons. Beacons are these fairly ubiquitous now. These intelligent sensors, like some of the stores like Nordstrom and Macy's have tried these things, where as long as you have the Macy's app, this beacon would be able to talk to you and send you an offer. Now, the big downside of the beacon working with an app was precisely what you mentioned, that it required people to have downloaded the app beforehand and again kind of be on alert and keep using it. Okay? However, in March of 2016, Google came out with a fascinating new technology called Eddystone, which actually does not require any more an app for the beacon to work. And again, the way this will work is very similar to what I mentioned before. The beacon basically pings your mobile browser, and a pop-up opens up in your browser itself, whether it's Safari or Chrome or IE, whatever what you have. And the fact that now you've got this technology that doesn't require an app to work, an app to be downloaded, again, is sort of a game changer, because it clearly, it sort of reduces some of those concerns we had before.
That's great, and it illustrates a good point about sometimes the early adopter of a technology is just an interim phase towards, there was a thought at some point that if you downloaded the XYZ app, you'd only interact with that organization or a company or whatever. And in fact, what you're describing is a much more open, so away from the notion of the so-called walled garden in the early days of the Internet. We're not going to have these captive audiences inside apps. They're going to be interacting through free Wi-Fi and as you described. One last, more of a comment that you might want to elaborate on, and then we'll wrap up. You mentioned the trajectory was less effective on weekends in predicting behavior because consumers seem to have a different mindset, and I think that's an important point to keep in mind. It's important for people using these devices and trying to customize offers to keep in mind the context in which it's happening. So do you want to elaborate on that a little bit, and the need to really be sure that you understand why the consumer is doing what they're doing in a given location before you try to help them do that?
Sure. So like I said, I think amongst the various insight, one thing that stood out for us was people do in fact have a different mindset when they're shopping on a weekend versus a weekday. One of those differences is that on a weekend, they often consider a trip to a shopping mall or a department store as a social trip with their family or with their friends. Now, on such occasions, because they're not necessarily as starved for time as they are on weekdays, they're more likely to explore, engage in variety-seeking behavior, which is, well-known consumer behavior concept in marketing, or they would like to try out, new brands or new stores. So in such a context, rather than, us sending them, products that we know they will buy based on past behavior, what you've seen is when we try new different categories, using randomized location-based offers or just randomized ads and offers, those tend to work better. So I think that's something that when we communicated back to the malls, they acted upon it, and they started getting more bang for the buck on the weekends. So that was useful.
Okay, well, that's a great note to end on. I want to thank you again so much, Anindya. If our speaker didn't get to your questions or you have additional things you'd like to discuss, we invite you to reach out to Anindya at aghose@stern.nyu.edu. There were a couple of questions about the machine learning technologies and the journals that you would recommend that might be more appropriate for an email exchange.
Sure.
So we'll hope that members will follow up on that. Our next webinar will be held Tuesday, February 21st at 1 p.m. Eastern Time. It will feature Ross Link, who is the former president of Global Market Return on Investment Solutions at Nielsen. His talk was also selected as the best of MSI for this series, so we encourage you to tune in for that next week. And many thanks to members of the MSI audience for participating in our member-to-member webinar series. And again, thanks to Anindya Ghose.
Thank you all for having me.